I'm sort of really interested in this idea that what is housing for? And housing is really essentially about building our communities and providing basic shelter for human needs. It has become an investment model, and so there's a tension between these. There's a tension between speculation and shelter. We all know that we really want affordable, amenable, diverse, sustainable, etc. housing that underpin strong communities. I was interested in this book that Peter Maher from Melbourne here has recently published, because I think it's really a very good overview of what's driving some of our issues behind housing. And it's interesting, probably in the 1940s, under Robert Menzies as then Prime Minister, this idea of the dream of owning a house emerged, and it's really influenced our housing stock from then on. And it's been therefore very long in the making, and it's not necessarily the simple model for our dense challenges, our urban challenges now, but it will probably take quite a long time to fix. And Peter advocates looking at the way that we deal with the financial models, and particularly around taxation issues, about investment in housing, encouraging investment in services, greater tenancy security, build to rent, a whole lot of issues that sit in inclusionary zoning, better planning. They all sit underneath our kind of challenge in designing appropriate housing. And we do all know that the challenge that we have about reinventing our cities, and very good work done here, of course, about what we need to think about in terms of this schism that has emerged between the notion of diversified models, simplistic models in investment, simplistic models in typologies. And it's that really that we have to break. And in New South Wales, some work's been done on this around the issue of what is called now the missing middle. But I think the interesting thing here is that a lot of government policy work was developed, and a code was developed, but it's become a very political issue. And what's happened more recently is that the whole push to rebuild the middle of our cities has been virtually stopped by the planning minister, who is worried about the politics. And so this question of engaging our community is the other dimension to how change might or might not occur. And of course, we see in other countries, in Singapore, this is work by Maher in Singapore, where different new models of how we live in high-rise starting to emerge, a greater diversity of types. We're seeing it with the emergence of co-living models. This is a new hotel that's just been built in Sydney, in Stanmore, by a hotel group, the Veru Hotel Group. And of course there's We Live, and there's Urban Co-op, there's the Collective. There's a whole lot of new moves emerging, and all importantly about a more diverse housing stock. This is Architecture Bulletins, a magazine that the Institute of Architects publishes in New South Wales. And this is a very good issue if you're interested in the topic. It really does look a lot into this whole question of not just affordability, but different housing typologies, both international and local. And I'm going to just touch on a few of the projects that it covers. There's a kind of a level of innovation and a level of quality and a level of understanding that's emerging in housing in models internationally, which we're a little bit behind the eight ball with. And hopefully we can learn from many of these. This one looks very much about the relationship between private and public space and semi-public places. The next one is Donnybrook in London, which is a very dense inner urban housing development, but importantly again values the public domain strongly and puts every entrance onto the street. And the Bordeaux one is by Land Architecture, and again is offering up a much more diverse way of living, and each block has individual courtyard and identity. There are new ways of actually constructing housing, and this is, really the cold shell or warm shell idea about housing. And it's a self-build, multi-storey project. We then go to the projects that are also happening now in Perth. And I think this is very interesting because it's the Housing Authority in Perth that's now looking into experimental new models, the Bograppen model, which Jeremy is very familiar with and will talk about, I'm sure. But this is where Landcorp partnered with the School of Architecture at the University of Western Australia and developed a few different models. There's sustainable housing for artists and creatives, which is really a cooperative housing model, and for rental. And then there's also a project called Gen Y Housing, which, interestingly, was an architectural competition for Gen Y architects, was won by David Barr, who's actually got a project here today. And it's looking at new ways of diversifying the housing models and perhaps transitional models of people going from low density into higher density. But just to take a bit of a step sideways, I think we all know the big challenge around climate and carbon. We know our governments aren't really doing enough about this by a long shot, and we know that cities will play a really critical part in this. And we know that buildings generate around some 25% of carbon emissions. We also all know that COP21 in Paris has set targets. Our country is committed to that, but we're not taking action. But the built environment can play a really important role. So it's not just a question of what role we can play in this big challenge, but it's also what it means to the affordability of housing. And if we don't tackle this, we're going to find that it's not just the capital cost of housing which is the issue, but it's the continuing cost to those who own it and to the planet. So because of that, we've been doing work in the Australian Sustainable Built Environment Council, and we've produced this document working with Climate Change, the research group out of Monash University, on how we can, simple changes and simple actions in the built environment can bring about an acceleration of our meeting of the overall targets. And I won't go into any detail, but there's also a significant financial saving, and the technologies exist today. And so it's not difficult, but getting that message to our politicians is difficult. And really it talks about 4 pillars of transformation. It's about ambitious energy efficiency, about low carbon electricity, getting rid of all the other sources, and it's about electrification and fuel switching, and it's about low emissions. And importantly also, there's some very simple policy solutions that can be applied. So at the moment, we're very strongly advocating this through government, and we're doing also additional work currently on the energy code as well. But it's not just about the code. The codes are important. It's also about biophilic and passive design. And this is, again, I think people like Woha, who are architects in Singapore, are really at the leading edge of this. This is a project in China, in Guangzhou. And these are not just token green efforts. They're all about buildings of natural ventilation, buildings that are low energy, buildings that use water effectively, etc. Touching on the policy levers, we in New South Wales had this CEP 65, which some of you may know of, and an apartment design guide. It's really about quality, but it's also about sustainability. There are some issues around compact apartments. This is a study done by Sylvester Fuller architects and Urbis planners for Landcom in New South Wales about compact housing models. And again, it's the role of government here to innovate and develop demonstration projects. This is a series of case studies that have been developed, which again demonstrate diversity and compact apartments. And it's not a new thing. This is a Harry Seidler and Partners building that was built for Navy people in Rushcutters Bay now very sought after, and in fact Sylvester Fuller owned an apartment in this building. This is a project in Helsinki called the Tiller Apartments, and again this is compact housing. Again, has a warm shell dimension to it. Again, the Borougruppen model. I wanted to just also highlight in Singapore again, WOHA are doing public housing. Singapore, in the green sense, is actually leading much of the world, I think. It's interesting that they've just got a very clear program about what needs to happen and what the planning strategies are, what the design strategies are. And then this is a project in New York, quite a recent project called Carmel Place in Manhattan, and it uses sort of prefabricated kit housing, and also has a very interesting management system around the support services that can be provided. So these are some of the lessons that came out of their study. You can do in compact housing, you can really reduce the costs back significantly. That can be cheaper to build, that they don't lose amenity, and that they are energy efficient as well. And so an amendment to our planning regulations, our housing regulations, SEP 65, is proposed out of this work to allow more compact housing. And I'm just going to end up with just a reflection upon equity in the city. And we're talking a lot about market-based housing, but really there's a big issue around homelessness in Australia. Over 110 or 120,000 people are homeless at any time. And I've got a bit involved in a common ground project, which is a model out of New York, in this case working with Grocon in Sydney, to develop the ultimate in compact housing. It's really almost a boarding house model, but it provides support services and security for people who are trying to get off the street and into a more normal housing model. And very compact, simple units, but housing that has quality and feels normalised in terms of the housing market. A bit of statistics around that. Mostly it's meaning to move tenants on, but there's interesting 30 of the original tenants are still there and have been there for over 4 years. And the average length of homelessness generally is about 13 years, so it's significant. So lastly, I've been doing some work recently on the fact that it's, I think the future of our housing is more than about housing. It's really about the nature of our cities. It's really about how we are able to think about the future of our cities and the way they sustain community life, the way they sustain broader uses. And I think that we do need more integrated, more connected, more resilient, more healthy and more equitable cities. So we're putting together, and we've got about 35 million committed from private sector and about seeking $45 million from the federal government to do a 10-year program of research that can really inform the way we deal with cities, the way we deal with housing within the cities. At the moment we've got Melbourne University, RMIT, Swinburne and Monash here from Victoria involved, plus universities around the country. And we hope that this will help us understand more about not the city as a whole just, but compact housing as well. Thank you.